Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. On this edition, we'll be joined by retired General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army in Europe, for his latest analysis on the efforts to end the war by the Trump administration. But first up, let's take a look at the most important stories coming straight out of Ukraine this week.
Russia continues to pummel Ukraine with airstrikes. Trump's first week in office saw over 1,000 bombs and over 700 drones targeting multiple regions, President Zelensky reported in an address on Sunday. One of the worst attacks this week targeted Zaporizhia, leaving 45 injured and 1 dead after apartment blocks collapsed under a barrage of missiles. Another deadly attack on Sumy killed 4 civilians, injuring 9 others, among them a 7-year-old child.
The explosion was horrible. I could hear glass shattering, and I got up. It was a nightmare. I've never heard anything like it. I live on the 3rd floor of the same building.
Despite the unrelenting assault, Ukrainian forces managed to strike down 50 of the 72 drones launched over the past weekend. Zelensky gave a statement on X, reiterating the urgent need for sustained sanctions against Russia and provision of long-range capabilities for the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukrainian forces have managed to successfully attack several military targets on Russian soil, the SBU reports. Video footage sourced from local CCTV cameras showed an oil refinery in Nizhny Novgorod engulfed in flames, purportedly the work of several UAVs. In Russia's Tver region, a missile arsenal and oil pumping station shared a similar fate, causing a major pipeline shutdown. The refinery is part of the Russian state-owned oil pipeline company Transneft. Oil refining infrastructure and pumping stations are considered key targets due to their vital role in the funding of Kremlin's war machine. These developments are a continuation of recent successes reported by Ukraine's armed forces, which managed to neutralize a major refinery in Ryazan just last week. The US has begun its transfer of around 90 Patriot air defense interceptors to Ukraine. The missiles are being moved from a storage facility in Israel and will make their way to Ukraine's battlefields through Poland. The Israeli Air Force officially decommissioned the Patriot air defense system in April 2023, more than 3 decades after it was first supplied to Israel during the Gulf War. With Israel now relying on its own advanced air defense technologies, including the Iron Dome, the Patriot system had been reduced to training or storage use. Following its retirement, Ukrainian officials approached both the US and Israel with a proposal to return the missiles to the US for refurbishment and subsequent delivery to Ukraine. Along with the interceptors, additional equipment, such as radars, will be sent to the US for refurbishment before final delivery to Ukraine. Russian forces have ramped up attacks near Pokrovsk in Ukraine's Donetsk region, deploying small groups in an effort to encircle Ukrainian troops, a military spokesperson reported. Pokrovsk, a critical logistics axis, has been a battleground for months. Numerous clashes have been reported in recent days as Russian troops attempt to advance from the west. Ukraine's general staff confirmed continued Russian offensive on multiple fronts, including Liman, Kramatorsk and Donetsk. Despite altering tactics to avoid urban combat and minimize losses, Moscow has so far failed to outflank Pokrovsk or cut off Ukrainian supply lines. The battle for control of the region remains intense. Russia's defense ministry announced on January 26 that its forces had seized Velika Novosilka, a key defensive post in the Donetsk region. Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade confirmed a partial withdrawal to avoid encirclement, but said battles continue on the village's outskirts. Russian troops are advancing slowly as they face fierce resistance. Ukraine's military has reported parity in equipment, but a significant Russian manpower advantage. The Mokry Yali River presents a hurdle to further Russian gains, leaving their forces vulnerable to counterattacks. Fighting remains intense across Donetsk, with Russian offensives targeting Kupiansk, Donetsk and Kurakovo. EU foreign ministers have extended sanctions on Russia, aiming to further weaken Moscow's war economy.
And now it's that time to look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist, and for that I'm joined by our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee. Hello there, Oz. Now, looking at the attacks that we've seen on Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil facilities, there seems to have been quite a drastic pickup over the last couple of weeks. So is this a new strategy being employed by Ukraine that it was unable to do before? And what impact is this having on Russian ability to supply oil to world markets?
So I wouldn't say it's necessarily new, but it does seem to be increasing. There were at least 81 Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil facilities in the year 2024. And since December, so over the last 60 days or so, there have been 13 attacks on Russian oil facilities by Ukraine, with the latest coming on Friday, Ukraine drone attack on a Lukoil facility in Volgograd. So there has definitely been a noticeable uptick in the amount of attacks. They're increasing in size. They are sending more drones to try and saturate Russia's air defenses. And must be said, many of these are getting through. Russia claims to intercept all of the drones as they come in, but the video footage showing large fires at all of the target sites paints a very, very different picture from the ones that Russian propagandists are trying to portray. So Ukraine is having some success in this field. At least it's hitting its targets. What impact is that having on Russia's oil economy is a different question. Obviously, it's difficult to get accurate figures coming out of Russia. However, Medusa, BBC Russian joint investigation recently published in January did try to investigate the impact on Russia's oil facility, how the process is affecting their ability to produce oil. However, look, again, it's difficult to find out in particular what the accurate figures coming out of Russia are. There is at least evidence that Ukraine seems to think that these attacks are having the desired impact. They are definitely increasing in number and increasing in size as the weeks go on. Up to you in the studio.
All right, Oz Chatterjee, thank you very much for joining us here on Ukraine This Week, and thanks for the update. And now joining us here on Ukraine This Week to discuss the new approach by the Trump administration to the war in Ukraine, and what we can possibly expect is retired General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe. Hello, General Hodges, and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Well, thank you guys for giving me another opportunity.
It's always great to have you on. I think the first thing I'd like to talk about and discuss is what has been heavily discussed lately, and this is the potential that European troops could be deployed to Ukraine as part of any kind of ceasefire or peace agreement. President Zelensky has previously flouted the possibility that it would need to be about 200,000 troops minimum, and we're hearing from the Trump administration that perhaps 40, 50,000 might do the trick. Overall, what are your general thoughts on this approach, and would it work?
So I want to say right up front that our priority should be helping Ukraine defeat Russia instead of prioritizing some sort of ceasefire. But I understand where we are. So to answer the question, before you can talk about the size of any kind of a peacekeeping force or peace enforcement force, you have to ask, what is the mission? I mean, what is their purpose? Are they going to be a force that's required to act to separate Russian from Ukrainian forces, sort of like what the NATO I-4 implementation force did in Bosnia back in 1995, 6, and 7, where you had a zone of separation? If that's the case, we're talking about 800 kilometers from north to south in Ukraine. It has to be wide enough to be beyond artillery range. So now you're talking, close to 200,000 troops, if that's the mission. If the mission is just to have outsiders there, some kind of contingency that could react to a possible Russian violation or something like that, that's a completely different type of force. So getting the mission right is always going to be job one. Once you have the mission right, then you have to have not only a clearly defined mission, but a clear chain of command, who works for who, and they have to have rules of engagement that will make sure that this force, whatever it is not something that the Russians will challenge.
Right. Now, that also begs the question of what if indeed those troops are engaged by Russian forces? Where does that put us, since they are part of NATO? Where does that put us with Article 5? Is there a danger that a direct conflict with Russia could break out in such an event?
Yeah, I would assume, we should assume that Russia will challenge this, whatever the agreement's going to be, they will challenge it immediately. Some way, somehow, with drones, strikes on the ground. I mean, they have a absolute perfect record of violating every agreement they've ever signed, unless there is a very, very strong, compelling compliance protocol. And so, again, it goes back to what is the mission that these guys are being sent there for? Who do they work for? What are their rules of engagement? And so there's no point in doing this if we send a force that looks like some blue-helmeted soldiers from Bangladesh or somewhere in Africa or South America. They need to be a no-kidding force that is joint, has all the capabilities needed, including air defense, long-range strike, counter-drone capabilities, and they need to have a force that is capable of inflicting real pain on the Russians if and when they violate it. Now, this is not going to be a NATO force, you're right. I would not imagine, because I think the Russians would never agree to it. But we still need to be prepared, whatever they are. And Russia should believe that this force will strike back in a very, very consequential way if they violate it. Otherwise, we're just going to be repeating Minsk 1 and 2, which were both failures.
Right, and if we look at the deployment of the observers of the OSCE mission, that obviously failed. I'm also wondering whether European nations alone, have the capabilities, as you've mentioned. If it were just European troops deployed there to Ukraine, would they have the capabilities needed to carry out a successful mission? And B, would they be respected to the same degree as if American troops would be on the ground? Is the American presence give extra credibility to such a force?
For me personally, of course we should have U.S. troops there, not for credibility of the peacekeeping force, but because this is in the strategic interest of the United States and our allies that Ukraine is ultimately successful. So I wish that my president would say, yeah, of course Americans are going to be a part of it, whatever is needed to help make sure it is a success. But let's assume that there will not be an American participation, not in any tangible way. Of course, European countries have the capability to do this. I mean, Poland alone has enormous military capabilities. The German Bundeswehr, the Brits, the French, I mean, all of our European allies have capability. What they lack is political will and self-confidence. And so if it's a European force only, capability-wise, absolutely they would have enough, assuming that they had a clear mission, a unity of command, and robust rules of engagement. But that means to get the right kind of rules of engagement, we require political will, that European countries would approve the idea that their soldiers could become engaged in direct combat after Russia violates whatever the agreement is, and we should not be naive and assume that they won't test it immediately.
Certainly. Now, another aspect here that we're seeing out of this new Trump administration is they've frozen all U.S. aid, and this is affecting Ukraine. We're still waiting to see exactly how deeply it affects Ukraine. But based on this, and based on the fact that the aid might not be freed up until it's thoroughly reviewed, and this could take a couple months, and that's even in question whether it will come through or not. What does this do for Ukraine? Does this shift resources from, for instance, fighting the war to, I don't know, trying to shore up the electricity supply in some regions? What do you think the impact of this is going to be on Ukraine in the short term?
Well, of course, the disruption of aid now because of a Trump administration decision, but it also happened during the Biden administration where we were disrupted for 8 months, where there was nothing going in because of our own domestic internal problems. This is a failure of strategic thinking. This aid is the fact that we're not consistent in providing what Ukraine needs reflects the fact that we don't actually have a clear strategic objective ourselves. If we had a clear strategic objective that we wanted Ukraine to win or to be successful somehow, then we would have the right policies. There would be no disruption, even with a change of administrations. It's obviously very unhelpful now, and it casts doubt in the minds of not only Ukrainians, but also Europeans. What's the U.S. going to do here? For the Russians, the only way the Russians win this war is if they see that we're going to quit. And so every time we stop or we hesitate or we disrupt aid that's going to Ukraine, that's a message to the Kremlin that we're not really committed and that we can be talked out of this. And so I think it's very unhelpful. Now, having said all that, Europe, the combined economies of Europe dwarfs the economy of Russia. And so if we got serious about shutting off Russia's ability to export oil and gas to India and to China, this war, the Russians would be on their knees. And yet, incredibly, the EU is talking about restarting buying Russian gas as somehow a way to bring the conflict to an end. I can't believe this is even actually a serious proposal by anybody, because that's exactly how we got into this thing back 3 years ago. So I think European countries can do a lot more, but again, it always comes down to political will.
Now, looking at the impact of Ukrainian strikes on oil facilities in Russia, they are supplementing the sanctions that are in place quite well. One thing that sticks out in my mind is Novorossiysk. This is a city that of strategic importance as far as Russia's ability to export oil, yet it's been untouched by Ukrainian forces. Do you think that there's some kind of limitations to Ukraine hitting those facilities in that city?
Great question, Dan. I don't know of a specific limitation on hitting Novorossiysk. I mean, they just hit a port up on the Baltic Sea, one of the biggest seaports in Europe, in the last 24 hours. So I don't know that there's a limitation on hitting Novorossiysk. They probably, I mean, my gosh, they have destroyed a significant amount of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure already. They've been hitting seaports. Novorossiysk is probably better protected than some of these other places on the Russian interior might be. It could be that. I don't know, but I think the Ukrainians understand that they are achieving very important effects against Russia's ability to pay for this war by going after their oil and gas refining and export capabilities. So if there's a restriction on Novorossiysk, I'm not aware of it.
Well, hopefully they'll still be allowed to strike those facilities at will. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to the situation in Kursk. What value do you think that this is going to hold in negotiations? Here we are all this time later, and Ukraine still has a very nice footprint there. So yeah, I do think this is going to provide Ukraine with a really good bargaining chip.
Yeah, I think this is, as we look back on this war in years to come, we're going to see the Ukrainian counteroffensive into Kursk as one of the most important steps of the war. The fact that after more than 6 months, they still control a sizable portion of the original Kursk bridgehead tells you how weak the Russians are, and it creates a real dilemma for the Kremlin. Because you remember that I think Lavrov or Putin, one or both of them, had said negotiations were going to start from the point of facts on the ground. In other words, what the line was what they were going to keep. Well, that creates a problem with Ukrainians controlling part of Kursk. And I imagine that this was one of the objectives on the Ukrainian side, to create this dilemma, as well as forcing the Russians to have to divert troops to deal with it, and they still have not been able to eliminate it. So I think this is good leverage for the Ukrainian side, and I believe they'll hang on to it as long as it's feasible for them to do so.
Speaking of the situation on the ground, it is reported by Ukrainian media outlets and others that North Korean troops are withdrawing from Kursk. The expectations are this is only temporary. What's your reaction to this news?
Well, I think what we've learned from watching how the Russians have employed the 12,000 or so Ukrainian troops, or the way the Russians have employed the 12,000 North Korean troops is that they were just more cannon fodder. They used them in these linear assaults against Ukrainian defenders, and they did it in a way that their grandfathers would have recognized back in the Korean War. You know, big lines charging across open fields, which made them very vulnerable to Ukrainian drones and artillery. So clearly, these North Korean soldiers were fit, tough, but trained for the wrong war. So perhaps they're being pulled out either because the losses are even worse than we thought, or they need a chance. Maybe they're going to try and retrain so they can adapt better to this battlefield. I'm not sure. And of course, the other part that we don't know is what is Kim Jong-un, what is the North Korean government getting in return for the sacrifice of these thousands of North Korean troops? I mean, if it's worth it from a financial or energy standpoint or technology standpoint, then Kim Jong-un, I don't imagine, will shed a lot of tears for these soldiers they've lost. Don't know if he's under any pressure on the North Korean side.
All right, well, we'll just have to wait and see how that develops. General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army in Europe, thank you once again for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Appreciate it.
I always enjoy your program. Thanks.
Thank you. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you for joining us, and see you again next week for all the latest news from Ukraine. Goodbye.